Right. Okay. Well, thanks for the intro, Haley. Almost had me welling up there, so I'm a little bit off balance after that. But thank you. It's very kind words, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for coming in this evening. It's about 20 to 12 UK time, so it's not that early for me. But yes, it's lovely to be here. It's always lovely to speak to friends in Hong Kong because I've now been working in Nepal, well, in the charitable sector for the last 22 years. And in many ways, the work of that charity started in Hong Kong for reasons that I shall explain. So I've got a very long track record in association, not only with UWC, but also with various schools and various individuals who live in Hong Kong, and I treasure those very much. I had invited a guy called David McCracken to join the call today. I don't know if he's picked up my message, but David was a former teacher at UWC, and he was one of the architects of the 24-hour race, along with Chris Schrader. And David is now living back in Northern Ireland with his wife Stella. We do keep in contact in a very strange kind of way because we share the same birthday. And I always make a point of getting in first and giving him the birthday greeting, which was last Tuesday, the 11th of March, when I turned 61. And David replied, and we had a very nice little exchange. He's a very strong advocate on the subject of human trafficking, and he still is as active as he can be in Northern Ireland. And I hope he hears this talk eventually, which is why I'm very keen to have it recorded today, so you can tune into that. When Haley kindly invited me to speak to you last week, I was a bit hesitant actually, because she was inviting me to talk to you on the subject of human trafficking and voluntourism. And my immediate response to that was to say, well, look, actually, I'm not really doing that anymore. I've sort of moved on from it, largely, not entirely. And maybe I'm not the right kind of person to speak to the students. And then on reflection, I thought, well, okay, there is obviously a very strong link with Hong Kong, which I treasure and I nurture. But on top of that, I thought it might be useful just to share with you my experiences of human trafficking, even though they are a little bit dated now, because they are worth sharing. I mean, my team in Nepal achieved a remarkable result in that we actually closed down 2 child trafficking routes during the time that I lived there between 2004 to 2012. I don't know of any organization that's managed to do that in recent memory. And that was just a few determined people, a lot of passion, which Haley has just alluded to. And I think to a certain extent, I'm just starting to read this book here, which is called Range, if you can read it backwards. And it just talks, how generalists triumph in a specialized world. And I came into the sector quite late in the day, and I think I brought with me a sort of a broad range of experience of life and so on, and that served me well. So I think one of the lessons really from today is, don't be sort of overawed by the experts and the specialists and all the rest of it. A lot of the time you just need common sense, and the older you get in life, the more experience you get, the more you can come in and look at things very objectively. And I would just, I'd say that don't be overawed by people that speak to you and think, oh, what can I do? You can do an awful lot. The name Pipal Tree, my charity name has changed several times over the last 22 years, which reflects, I suppose, in some respects, a change in my own emotions as I've changed from within. I've also learned lessons, but also to a certain extent, it's responding to perhaps a different perception of priorities. And these days, probably my main priority, to be honest, is climate change. I think that's the biggest threat to all of us. All these issues that are out there of human trafficking and gender-based violence, you name it, there's a lot of really important issues. But for me, the one that's hanging over all of us is climate change, and time is against us. And that's where my sort of priorities lie at the minute. Up until 2 months ago, Pipal Tree had a different name, and Haley mentioned it there. It was chori. And chora chori is the Nepali word for children. So we were very much a children's charity. And then I think with this growing interest in the environment and the climate, that name just really wasn't fit for purpose anymore. We had to change the name to reflect better where we are. And a Pipal tree is, you'll see quite a lot of them across the Indian subcontinent. That picture is taken in Nepal. The Pipal tree is it's sacred to both Buddhists and Hindus. So it was underneath the Pipal tree that Buddha found his enlightenment. And you'll see in the Nepali towns and villages where Hindus will be tying threads around the trunk of the tree, and they'll be doing their prayers there and so on. But also the Pipal tree is found in the heart of a lot of towns and villages. It is a focus for the community. It is a meeting place. And for me, that name really embodied, meeting with communities, understanding their needs, but also to a certain extent meeting with supporters. And like today, I mean, that's a really important thing to do, to get the message out there, to hear what issues people raise. And then, if you have questions at the end, by all means, please do ask me. So it's a very good symbol of what we want to do. And of course, I'll talk later on about the reforestation work that we're doing in Nepal. These trees are native to Nepal, so we're planting a lot of Pipal trees and a load of other native species at the minute. So it's doubly important from that point of view. I don't know if any of you have been to Nepal. It's quite a remarkable country. Just really in brief, it's sort of oblong shape, lying between China and India. Population 31, 32 million, something like that. And it's a very unusual country because that picture was taken last year with lockdown in Nepal. Like in a lot of places, the air became very clean, and people were able to take photographs right across the country from south to north. So here you have someone standing on Nepal's southern plains, which are only just above sea level, totally flat. It's called the Terai. And then in the middle distance, you've got hills, which is where you find Kathmandu. And then in the far distance, you see the Himalayas. And of course, highest point on Earth, Everest, is there. So in the space of just 200 kilometers, you go from sea level to the highest point on Earth. And there's a whole range of ecosystems in between. So it's quite a fascinating country, if only from that point of view. But there's so many other things that you could talk about, history and culture and goodness knows what else. But I'll just mention that in passing. The area that, when a lot of people go to Nepal, they of course gravitate towards the mountains, and they'll be going on treks. And I think to a certain extent, a lot of the organisations that come to work in Nepal will also have the same kind of focus of being in the hills, being in the mountains, a bit more scenic, a bit more things going on, perhaps. But actually, I'm working primarily in the south of the country on these plains, where this is the sort of scenery that you will get there. Again, flat fields, paddy fields where they grow rice and a range of crops. But you see right in the background there, mud huts with thatched roofs. I mean, the area is very, very poor indeed. And this is one of the, I suppose, the key considerations really of why I'm working there. You've got that poverty, you've got ethnic issues. For example, only 7% of the population of South Nepal, which is the very populous part of the country, only 7% speak Nepali. That's quite a problem if you're trying to access government services. Even last year when there was lockdown and there was there was food relief and so on available from the government, it was only available to Nepali citizens. A lot of the people here aren't Nepali citizens, although they've lived here for generations. And thankfully, Pipal Tree was able to intervene, and we delivered food relief to 28,000 people last year, people who were on the verge of starvation. And for me, that was one of my proudest moments in 22 years, being able to do that. There's also all the issues with gender-based violence. You've got the dowry system, which is illegal in Nepal, but it's still active in South Nepal, which means that you have child marriage. Girls are getting married at age 12, 13, up to about 16. That's the sort of almost like the top age. One of the things that is driving that, aside from large families and lots of girls and so on, is the dowry system, because the younger a girl gets married off, the lower is the dowry payment that her father has to make. So that's, as soon as the girl's hitting puberty, there's a big motivation there to find her a husband. And it can also backfire as well on girls who stay on at school, get a good education, you might become a teacher or something like that. In those circumstances, the father has to pay an absolute fortune of a dowry to find a husband to match that girl's level of academic achievement. It's a very complex thing. I say there's ethnic issues. This part of Nepal is very, if you went and visit, you'd say this is India. The way people dress, the way people look, and a lot of the people who live in the north of the country come more from the sort of Mongoloid tradition, shall we say, and they can discriminate against these people in the south. So they got a very raw deal. I've gone into that in quite a lot of detail because it explains why you've got the high incidence of rape, for example. You've got dowry violence, you've got Burns violence, you've got stigmatization, and of course you've got human trafficking as well. And just imagine a girl in this situation, how vulnerable she is. What's her access to justice if she doesn't speak Nepali? You know, what does she count for? It's a very, very difficult situation. I'm very proud, after 22 years of Nepal, working in Nepal, to be actually focusing on this area, because for me, this is where the need is the greatest. It's not up in the mountains. Yes, there's need there, but I think it's being pretty well addressed by a lot of organizations who have chosen to locate themselves there. In the south, this area gets overlooked, and I'm pleased to be there. Sorry, I've dwelt on this slide quite a lot because it's quite an important one. In the midst of all that poverty, there's some lovely, lovely traditions, and there's a very strong artistic tradition, and this is the so-called Maithili art style, which is local women paint in this style, and they're just painting from within their heads. They paint pictures of their lifestyle, and what they do is they will actually paint a lot of scenes on the walls of these mud huts that I was showing you a minute ago. So you have this sort of juxtaposition of poverty and yet this amazingly powerful art, which I just love. So the girls painted as this little strip. We asked them to show us what they would like their lives to be like. So this reflects female empowerment. So you can see a girl sitting at a sewing machine, another girl sitting at a laptop, you know, a teacher on the left of my screen. And this is the aspirations, and this is one of the things that Pipal Tree is doing, you know, support to women and girls. And this is again another reason why we moved out of chora-chori children. It was getting into those broader issues that really matter. It's very hard to be focused and say we just do children, when you see the kind of the need that is there, and if you look at the little sun just there, you will understand where we got our logo from, which has just been redesigned. Okay, moving on from that, the sort of my memoir, which was mentioned in Haley's introduction. It's a memoir of 15, 20 odd years. It goes back to my earlier life and my first marriage, which ended in tragedy, and how I moved into the charitable sector. And it's, although I've written it myself, I have to say it is a very interesting read, because it's a very unusual read, and it's a story that I felt was well worth telling rather than being sort of self-indulgent. Very, very strange things happened to me and happened around me, and I think I would recommend it to you actually just as a good read, especially if you're getting involved in the development sector and maybe want to see it with a different perspective, the sort of perspective of a generalist. I'll move on from the plug. That's me back in 1987, Captain Holmes in the British Army. I was actually a dentist by profession. I joined the army in 1982, and I rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. I had a very good career in the army. Probably it would have become a full career had things not, had my marriage not ended so tragically. I did my master's in dentistry in 1997, and I'd kind of reached a sort of a peak in the profession. In 1988, I married this lady, a lady called Esther Benjamins. A very unusual mix. Esther was Dutch Jewish, and I was Northern Irish Presbyterian, so totally different backgrounds, but for some reason it worked very well indeed. It was a very happy marriage indeed. Esther was in the first part of her life, she was a social worker in Holland, where she worked with survivors of the concentration camps and the Holocaust. And she actually wrote up her work at that time, and it was subsequently published in Holland. How to manage survivors of the Holocaust, written from a Jewish perspective, because Esther's clients were sharing with her things that they wouldn't tell to a Gentile, and she documented these with due sensitivity, actually. And it was only after her death that I translated it into English, and I really got to know her much better after her death, actually, because I was going into a taboo subject, and it was very revealing indeed. Then in this later part of her life, she became a lawyer, and then just before her death, she was a judge, newly appointed judge, and very clever, very capable. But in January 1999, she took her own life, stating childlessness as the reason for her death. And I think there might have been other reasons to it, which I've discussed in the book. I'll leave you to read that for yourselves. But that was what I had to deal with in January 99, loss of a wife, that acute trauma, the tragedy, a whole range of emotions. And I suppose underneath it all, there was a big sense of not being prepared to accept failure. I mean, she was very much one of the strongest people I've ever met in my life, which is why it was so atypical for her to take her own life. But I felt that, I was still alive. I was still there to take up the fight, to carry on. And although she had failed, in inverted commas, I certainly hadn't failed, and I wasn't going to fail. That was a huge part of the motivation, if you like. And I decided really within a week of Esther's death, within days of Esther's death, that my career as a dentist was over, my career in the army was over. I was going to resign from that, and I was going to set up a children's charity in Esther's name. And I suppose, again, what part of this presentation is about charting my emotions, my feelings, why they changed, why they shifted. The setting up of the children's charity was very much a direct response to that childlessness. Esther had just written a one-line suicide note that, life without children had become unbearable for her, quote. So I was determined that, okay, let's have children. We will set up a children's charity. There are children who need family, who need this kind of support. And that was the response to that. I think the other key bit of philosophy was that I wanted to do something that would actually make a difference, rather than just getting lost in the crowd of, charity funding that's out there. I had a little bit of money to start off with, because I was eligible for a pot of money from leaving the army. It was about £30,000, and I just invested all of that into this new charity. And I have to say, I never missed it. It was the best investment I ever made. But the key thing was how to make that money count, and how it shouldn't get lost in an ocean of need. And I think that's a very important thing, and that requires a certain amount of finding of focus. Esther died in January 99. I went to Nepal for the first time in November 99, and I had absolutely no idea what to do. I'd never been to Nepal before. I'd never been to Asia before. Why Nepal? Well, there's some of you may be aware, there's a very long tradition, a connection between Nepal and the United Kingdom and the British Army through the Gurkhas, the Nepali soldiers who serve in the British Army and have served with great distinction for the last 200 years and more. So there was a sort of very tenuous connection, because where I was living in England, we had Gurkha neighbours, Nepali neighbours, and I knew that Nepal was way down the league table in terms of the world's poorest nations. So I thought, well, this is probably a good place to start as any. But I went to Nepal as a total, we say the word greenhorn. I knew nothing about Nepal, knew nothing about Asia, knew nothing about charity, actually, for that matter. You know, I was a generalist. And we looked around and all the rest of it. And it was just on that first visit in November 99, this headline appeared in the Kathmandu Post, and it flagged up how children were in prison with their parents, innocent children who were in jail in the absence of anybody who's prepared to look after them, basically. And of course, this is a terrible breach of human rights, terrible way to treat children in free association with adult criminals. You know, and down in the article, you know, it said down here that there was 100 children below the age of 14 in the prisons of Nepal. So I thought, well, look, here's a number that it's big, but you know, I can make some sort of an impact on that. Whereas if you looked at the scale of general poverty within Nepal, it really would have been a drop in the ocean. So this article seemed to be staring me in the face. We started. Well, I suppose one of the big things was that I'd wanted to set up a children's home, which is against how a lot of foreigners tend to start in Nepal if they don't know any better. It's the worst possible decision you could make to set up a children's home. And it's very difficult to do it these days because not even the Nepal government likes the concept anymore. And it kind of, but I was very emotionally driven to set up this family for Esther, the family that she'd never had. Find a building, bring the kids in, and you know that they would become Esther's children, in inverted commas. But then, you know, where do you begin? Where do you end? And here was this article that was talking about children in prison. I thought, well, okay, if you could bring those children out of the prison, look after them until such times as their parents are released, and then return them to the families, then this children's home would actually be serving a very good purpose. And that kid there looking through the bars is a little boy called Bajendra Pun, who was one of the first kids that I brought out of prison. He's now must be in his early 20s. He's married. He's a teacher. He's got a kid of his own, at least one kid of his own. And, you know, and some of these kids who I was helping back in 2000, 2001, I'm very proud to have them as Facebook friends who check in and wish me a happy birthday and things like that. So that's been very rewarding, and it's great to have had on an individual basis the chance to help children like that and transform lives. This picture was taken in I think it was it was March 2000, and it was taken by a Hong Kong-based photographer called Graham Uden inside Kathmandu jail. I was there with Graham. And with a Hong Kong-based journalist called Fionnuala McHugh, who you may have heard of. And Fionnuala and Graham were reporting for the South China Morning Post. And of course, the story was the background of what I was doing, why I was doing it, but also this issue of children in prison. And that picture was taken, and you can see the children there, the adults, and the smiles and all the rest of it. Underneath it all, I was really thinking to myself, what on earth am I doing here? You know, what is this ex-British Army dentist doing inside a prison in Kathmandu? Probably on my, second visit to Nepal by this stage, knowing nothing about anything, it seems, seemingly. And you know, there must be so many other people better qualified than me to be doing this, who are experts on child rights and prison reform or goodness knows what else. But there I was. And to be honest, I maybe felt a little bit like a fraud. But, you know, you sort of went with it. And then during the visit, I looked around and I saw that picture. And again, taken by Graham Uden. And there's a little boy there, obviously shaven head with a striped pajama top. And that really brought me up short. And I thought, blimey, because that picture for me bore a very strong resemblance to that. And just before Esther died, by the way, I commend the writer Primo Levi to you if you haven't read the book. An Italian Jewish survivor of Auschwitz who writes in the most objective, detached terms about his experience inside the camps. And I was reading this actually probably about two or 3 months before Esther died, and it was my bedside table. And she came to the bed one night. She said, "Would you just turn that over, please? I can't look at that image anymore." And I think when I saw that child inside the jail, it really made me feel that I was absolutely in the right place, and I felt much better after that. And the thing was, as I was leaving the jail, Fionnuala turned to me and said, "Did you see anything in there that reminded you of anything else?" And that's how sharp she is. She spotted it straight away. And I said, "Yeah, the kid with the shaven head and the pajama top." So there were a few very strange developments in this story, and I document them in Gates of Bronze. There's a lot going on around us that we don't know, that we don't understand. We have all the new atheists out there, the Richard Dawkinses of this world, and people like that. There is another dimension. That's another message that must come out of that. You better believe it. And the older you get, the more you see it. So that was how I ended up with Esther's family, the children in a refuge, and the kids did very well. And but I have to add a very big but here. Be very careful of getting involved in any children's home or refuge anywhere in the world, because a lot of the time these are money-making operations being run not in the best interests of the children. They lead to institutional care if they're run badly. A lot of the time, but not always, a lot of the time children are better off back with their families. Haley asked me to talk about volunteerism. Historically, it has been a big thing of, well, it's cool to go and work in an orphanage in Nepal or something like that, and have what seem like meaningful interactions with children and so on. Not at all. By taking part in some of these things, you can be contributing inadvertently to the institutionalization of children and child trafficking and a lot of other things. You just won't know what you're letting yourself in for. So a word of caution there, a very big word of caution. I also have to qualify that by saying that I know of probably about half a dozen, let's call them children's homes in Nepal, that I would say are very, very good, that are being run by genuine people whose hearts are totally in the right place. I can think of wonderful people like Bonnie Ellison from the States, who has given her life to support these children for decades. And they do wonderful, wonderful work, but they are in a very small minority. The other thing I would say is that when we were running this refuge, there was a very good justification for it, because it was looking after children of prisoners and later trafficking victims until such times as they reunited with families. These children were given opportunities, undoubtedly, that they would never have had. If you'd returned them to those kind of villages that I showed you at the start of the presentation, their prospects would have been zero. They'd have been married off when they were 12, 13, 14. We were able to give some of these kids a really good education. There was one little girl who came through this children's home of ours, and 4 or 5 years ago she passed her bar council exams, and she's now a practicing lawyer in Kathmandu. She would not have had that opportunity if we followed the old mantra of getting children back to families. You have to take each case on its own merits, really. But I say, be careful of the children's homes. They are not what they seem, and a lot of what you see in Nepal is not what it seems. Just a little snapshot taken inside a jail, Tansen prison in West Nepal. Little girl there, named Preeti. That's her now. So it's again lovely to see just how some of these children have blossomed into splendid young adults, is the word to describe them. Moving on from that, in November 2001, I suppose 2 years after I got started, the Nepal government outlawed the jailing of children, rather than outlawed the jailing of dependent children, innocent children. And it still happens, I have to say, but, you know, and let's not go there. But certainly at that time, I felt it was time to move on from that. I like to think that all of the stuff that I did at that time in terms of bringing children out of prisons, but also the huge media coverage that went around the world. It was in Hong Kong, it was Boston Globe, it was Melbourne Herald Sun, all around the world had some kind of influence on that. But I can't prove it, but it certainly didn't do any harm. But in November 2001, I felt the need to sort of move on to something else as a new cause. And it was then that I became aware, anecdotally, of this particular issue. And this picture is taken inside a circus in India. The guy in the center of this picture, big man, is a guy called Fateh Khan. He is one of a number of brothers who certainly, this is back in 2001, who are running large circuses in India. And very, very dangerous man indeed. These guys were up to everything, you know, gun running, drugs. There were murderers running circuses. I mean, they were not nice circus owners you might imagine, far from it. And where were they getting the performers from? A lot of them, well, 99% of them were Nepalese children, child performers. We did the first research on this. This was in 2002. And about half of the children, Nepalese children, were coming from Nepal itself, and the other half were coming from sort of ethnic Nepali parts of North India. And basically, you know, 80% of the children inside circuses were girls. The average age for joining the circus was 8 or 9. You'd have kids about the age of 4, 5 joining. By the age of 13, 14, they're getting a bit too old because their bodies would be stiffening up, so they couldn't be trained as gymnasts. But actually, these circuses were essentially prisons in disguise, because once those girls were trafficked into the circus to become slaves, they didn't get back out again until the circus owner actually felt like releasing them. They were serving a sentence, which they would call a contract. You know, they'd have a 10 to 15-year contract, which was actually an illegal document, and that bound these children to the circuses. If they tried to escape, they'd get beaten up, they could even be killed. But inside the circuses, inside these prisons, it was a real hotbed of abuse, violence. The whole training was fueled by violence, by beatings, and there was a huge amount of sexual violence as well. Rape was endemic in these circuses. It's a huge subject, which I'll not go into in much detail, but this is the kind of image that you're looking at here, looking at very emaciated children. I mean, their weights were kept down by their being chronically underfed, and they just led a totally miserable lifestyle up at 4 or 5 in the morning, and they'd work right through it to 11 o'clock at night, and that was day after day after day the same. If there was a public holiday, they had double performances. There was absolutely no respite in this lifestyle at all. And I suppose one of the things with when I was working on the prison children, I mean, that was, as the emotions, I was trying to create this sort of artificial family, you know, for in Esther's memory. But I always felt there was something bigger around the corner, and that sort of Holocaust thing was in the back of my mind. I was really looking maybe for some other way to commemorate Esther's remarkable work properly, rather than just being in terms of you know, being a mother to children sort of thing, and recognizing her professional life and her work in the Holocaust and so on. You know, in 2001, 2002, there wasn't very much I could do at that stage that wasn't being done already by a lot of other people, and there was no other situation that could really mirror the Holocaust. I mean, that's been a one-off event which is unique in its horror, and nothing matches it. However, I was looking at something here that had at least echoes of what Esther had dealt with, and the trafficking situation reflected that. So, for example, when Jewish people were taken to the camps, there was one particular camp at a place called Mauthausen, where they set up this kind of sham camp that made it all look quite nice, so they could bring the Red Cross to visit, and it was all lovely. There was a camp orchestra, and people thought, it's not that bad. They didn't take the Red Cross to visit Auschwitz or Belsen or any of these other places. And all these, there was so much deception by the Nazis in terms of sending back feel-good stories, to families and all the rest of it, as a way of, reassuring people that the deportations were safe, which they weren't. And we were getting the same kind of thing happening in the circuses. I mean, this is a picture taken of a girl inside a circus, dressed in her finery, posing with a flower. That doesn't look too bad at all. If the family members had seen the first picture that I showed you, those little emaciated girls, it'd have been a different situation altogether. Here's another picture of a girl dressed up very nicely. Behind her, by the way, is a big metal fence that's about 2-3 meters high, so you can't get over it. And the girl's standing here holding a toy. The cuddly toy is still wrapped in plastic. It hasn't even been taken out of the plastic wrapper. And you can see that downcast look of unhappiness that just sort of shines through in the picture. Very tragic, haunting picture. So there was all this deception that goes hand in hand with trafficking as well. And also inside this little picture wasn't taken for a family, I don't think, but it's inside the circuses. The girls had set up little shrines. A lot of the girls would actually become Christians. And there's a picture of Jesus, and they would pray to Jesus for survival. And if they survived, the various acts that they did and the brutality, I think, but if they managed to get out of the circuses in due course, they'd see that as a vindication of their religion. So very haunting images, which I'll not dwell upon any further. In 2004, I moved to live in Nepal with my wife. I remarried in 2002. That's Beverly and me, newly arrived in South Nepal. I went to live there because with taking on this circus challenge, if you like, it became very obvious to me that if I wanted to get a result, I'd have to be in the country myself and lead this and drive it along. Because the scale of the undertaking was massive. I mean, if you're taking children out of prisons and so on, well, that's not such a big deal in some respects, because all the prisons are there in Nepal, easy to get to, and yeah, it's not necessarily easy to get the children out. There's bureaucracy and all the rest of it, but it's a very sort of centralized kind of project, and also taking children out of prisons is neither here nor there in terms of you're not interfering with anybody's business. If you're going into India and working across the border into the length and breadth of India, and you're interfering with trafficking and interfering with the businesses that are being run by very nasty people, it's an extremely dangerous pastime. And I felt I could not expect my local staff at that time to be doing this themselves. It was asking too much of them. I had to be there myself. And I moved across in October 2004. I said that I was only going there for 2 to 3 years. At least that's what I told my in-laws, who are getting very elderly. I ended up staying for 8 years, but certainly when I went there, I said that I would not be returning to live in the United Kingdom until this issue was resolved, this issue of the trafficking of children to circuses. And what we did, again, in an absolute nutshell, because it's a huge subject, we started launching rescue operations against the circuses. And this particular picture actually it wasn't taken in India, it was taken in Nepal, but it's an Indian circus that made the mistake of crossing the border into Nepal, and it became a very, very easy target in some respects. This is actually the Nepal army and police entering. There's a very strong antipathy between Nepalese and Indian people. So if you have an Indian circus that's abusing Nepalese children on Nepali soil, it's not so difficult to get collaboration from the authorities. Different story in India, which I'll come on to later. But again, look at the big sort of fence here. You know, this is a prison. So underneath all these colors and all the rest of it, it's a totally different story. And so we brought girls out of that circus. We raided these circuses across all of India. That's one taken in 2007. This guy here is actually a brother of Fatih Khan, the guy who I showed you earlier with all the little Nepali girls standing around him. By this stage, you know, we had circus rescue down to a fine art. We were able to enter this circus. This is in South India, where you get much better cooperation than you do in North India. North India is bandit country, and the circuses had a lot of the circuses had links with the police and the local authorities and all the rest of it. So to try and break into that was very difficult. In the South India, it was much easier. But you know, you still had challenges like this guy here in the background who's suddenly very camera shy. He was at the local Labour Employment Office. You know, he was in cahoots with this guy here. He obviously didn't want his picture taken on the day. But, you know, from that circus, I think we brought 23, 24 girls out of the circus that day. I mean, that did a huge amount of damage to this circus, and we were taking away their investment. Over the course of those 8 years that I lived in Nepal, we brought 350 children back from circuses to Nepal. On top of that, the circuses released voluntarily another 350 children. So there was a total of 700 children. Why did they do that? Because they didn't want to be raided by the police and face the risk of criminal prosecution. So that was the impact that we had in terms of rescuing children. When we brought them back to Nepal, the challenge was far from over, because you then had the problems of, again, with echoes of the Holocaust and Esther's work, you had the problem of managing survivors, little girls who were returning to Nepal with post-traumatic stress disorder, severe mental health problems, and how we managed that's another story altogether. And then the other thing that we did was that we started to identify the traffickers. And this guy here, his name is Danny Gurung. And in 2006, with the support of girls whom we had rescued from the circuses who gave evidence, we managed to get this guy into prison. And he went to prison for 20 years. And this was the first person who went to prison for trafficking girls to circuses. It was the first time that a court in Nepal recognized the circus as being a trafficking destination. Prior to that, trafficking meant the sex trade. And really what we had to contend with was this sort of smokescreen of, you know, the circus is part of tradition, it's culture, it's art, it's giving jobs to girls who wouldn't have it otherwise, all these kinds of nonsense stories. And based upon the evidence that we presented in court, the court recognized that the circus was a trafficking destination. They threw the book at this guy. He got the maximum sentence, 20 years in prison. That's 2006. Well, he's probably got another 4 or 5 years left to serve to get no remission at all for human trafficking. If you want to stop child trafficking, this is one of the best ways of doing it. Find the traffickers and put them in jail. But easier said than done. At least in this case, we had set a legal precedent. And because the court recognized the circus as a trafficking destination, it paved the way for another 18 traffickers to be sentenced. And really by 2011, we were still going to India on circus rescue operations, and we were finding that the trafficking had actually stopped and there were no children to rescue. Why were there no children to rescue? Well, we had sort of turned off the tap at one end. In Nepal, there were no traffickers operating. They were all in jail, at least the ones who were trafficking to the circuses. And at the other end, the circuses didn't want Nepalese children anymore because it was too much hassle. That's why they were returning them voluntarily. And the circuses were starting to recruit performers from Kenya and the Russian Federation and places like that, all over the place. And they'd be bringing in adult performers, so they were changing their ways, and this was trying to change with the times. So the project was kind of coming to almost like a natural conclusion, and it was becoming just increasingly cost ineffective to go all the length of India, turn up at a circus and find there was nothing there. So we just kind of reached that point, and then, hey presto, out of the blue, one of the other things that we had been doing, pursuing legal action in India, reached its conclusion when the Indian Supreme Court ruled that children, i.e. kids under the age of 18, could not be used as child performers anymore. It was illegal. And that kind of put the seal onto what we had achieved. I felt, yes, it's quite possible that if you went to a circus now, you might find a child or a couple of kids inside a circus, tragically. But anybody who's doing that is operating illegally, clearly. There's no dispute anymore about that, and they're taking a very big risk. In practice, what has happened since 2012, a lot of the circuses have shut down. They were on their last legs anyhow. They're not allowed to use, certainly when we started with children, they weren't allowed to use wild animals at that stage when we started, and there's tigers and lions and whatever. They couldn't do that. Then the children became the star attraction, the Nepalese children. They couldn't do that. Then they were still using so-called domestic animals. An elephant is a domestic animal in Nepal, by the way. So you can still use elephants and horses and dogs and things like that. They couldn't even do that anymore because of the impact of the animal rights activists. So this was just a dwindling industry that has pretty well imploded over the last 10 years. And I'm very proud that we made a contribution to that. And I guess if circus has a future in India, it'll be in the contemporary circus style. And that's fine. I can get on with it. Just moving on very quickly to that was the first child trafficking route that we shut down, the trafficking of children to circuses, and we shut it down, as I saw it, permanently because of that legal action. This is a guy who I write about in Gates of Bronze, and his name is Dr. P.P. Job. The late Dr. P.P. Job, who was as nutty as a fruitcake. He was a self-styled India's Billy Graham. So he was a very prominent evangelist, Protestant evangelist, originally from Kerala in South India. And in some ways we had been sort of parallel stories, because in 1999, he lost his son in a car accident, a hit and run in India, and he said this was he labelled his son as a Christian martyr, and this was a murder, but I don't think there was any evidence to support that at all. But what he determined he would do in memory of his son was set up a children's home, and he would set this up for girls, and these would be for the children of Christian martyrs from all over the region, North India, down into Myanmar. There were even kids coming from Tibet, China, the Nepal, Bhutan, that whole region. And his idea was that, totally warped, he would bring these children to his school, residential school in south of India, and he would turn them into missionaries. That was basically his agenda. And he would give them a full education right up to university level, so that they would leave his college that he set up in memory of his son with a degree in one hand and a Bible in the other. That was his vision for his response to his son's death. How was he getting his children? From Nepal, he was relying on this guy. He's a chap called D.B. Federa, Dal Bahadur Federa. I took this picture of D.B. Federa. We had a sort of confrontation with him in 2011. I don't think he quite liked having his picture taken, but let's set that aside. Essentially, in the early 2002, 2003 or thereabouts, This guy was operating in a very poor region of northwest Nepal called Humla. And at that time, there was a so-called Maoist People's War going on. It ran from 1996 to 2006, a 10-year People's War. And at that time, certainly in northwest Nepal, the Maoists were very much in control, and a lot of the schools were shut down. Kids were being conscripted into the People's Army. Parents were desperate. So when you talk about trafficking, you've got the push factors and the pull factors. And I should really have said that with the circus. The push factors are the things that drive kids and people out of their home communities. So it can be poverty, it can be ignorance, it can be, no prospects at all. So here were kids in northwest Nepal, no schools, no education, no jobs, parents desperate, didn't want them to join the People's Army, didn't want to lose their sons and daughters in the People's Army. Step in your trafficker and introduce the pull factors, the things that draw them out of their home area. And he was saying, right, I will give your child I'll take them to a safe place, I'll give them an education, I'll give them jobs, and all these things. And just like you had the pull factors of India for the circuses, Bollywood and stardom and all kinds of stuff, he was offering incentives. So you had those two things, and people are desperate, and they will take a risk, and off the trafficker goes with these children. What was he doing? Some of the little children, the babies, he was putting them off into inter-country adoption. So next thing, a child is a fake orphan and being adopted by a family in Spain or something like that, unaware that the child's parents are alive and well. Another thing that he was doing, he was taking the boys into these really grubby children's homes in Kathmandu, where they'd be out begging on the streets. Again, this is the kind of income generation aspect of these fake orphanages. But for the girls, he was taking them right down to South India and handing them over to Dr. P.P. Job. And that was them. They were being taken down just like the circus kids. They were sort of 4 years old, 5 years old, that kind of age, and they were taken there, and they were really essentially being held there until they turned whatever it was, 21, 22, complete their education, and there you have it. This monstrosity of a place. I could talk about Vermbrand, but that's a different thing. You'd read about that in the book. Orphan girls. This was a complete lie. These children were not orphans. They're being presented as the children of Christian martyrs, Christians who had been killed by the nasty Maoists, for standing up for their faith. Absolute nonsense. The parents of these children were alive and well, and they were Hindu or Buddhist. They were not Christians. He was then presenting these children on a website with totally different names, totally different identities. Note they're all like Christian names. So they've lost their identity. Again, breach of human rights, of course, breach of privacy. I mean, you breach. Everything's wrong about this. And each child would have a fake profile saying, oh yes, mother was killed and father, blah, blah, blah. Absolute nonsense. But this was how he was presenting his work to gullible foreigners. So you can be a gullible foreigner and go as a volunteerist and volunteer in a children's home, or you can be a gullible Christian sitting in America thinking, yes, I'll sponsor little Abigail. What a terrible story. And this is just how people get preyed upon, basically. So a total sham. I think by the time we intervened, there were something like 500 girls at this college, drawn from all over the region. As I said, there were 23 or 24 of them from Nepal, and we decided to go and bring them back. And it's a very long, very, very long and involved story attached to this. But essentially, this picture was taken on the day of the rescue. Now, look, this isn't what you saw inside the circus with little emaciated girls and all the rest of it. Look at them, white uniforms, ties, and all the rest of it. I didn't get any evidence of violence any more than you get in any other Indian school in terms of corporal punishment and so on. But that's not saying that's fine. But you know, these kids on the face of it were getting a good education in inverted commas, but they were being exploited. They were being manipulated. They were being used for Dr. Job's agenda, and they were being detached from their families, from all their connections. This lady in the middle, wearing in the red, that's one of the mothers, and we took her down to help with the identification of the children. And her daughter's somewhere in there. I can't remember which one it is exactly, but she couldn't actually speak to her daughter because people from northwest Nepal speak the Humle language, and that was the only language that this woman spoke. So when she met her daughter was speaking English, so they couldn't communicate. And this is the kind of stuff that was going on. So we intervened. We brought the kids back, and as soon as we were back, all hell broke loose. Essentially, it was a very different scenario from the circuses because the traffickers we were dealing with then were pretty sort of small time individuals, you know, men and women losers actually. I mean, they were just going around the villages picking up kids and making a fast buck. Here we were dealing with a very, very dangerous, violent man with very strong political connections. Here he is, sitting on the right, looking very disinterested. That is the former Prime Minister of Nepal. They're having tea together. This is the level of contact traffickers can have with politicians and senior politicians. This is protection, and politics is king in Nepal. So when we brought these children back, this guy, D.V. Federa, was waiting for us at the border, which is where I took that picture. And he then turned the tables on us very, very cleverly. He said we were a bunch of adventurers. We were out headline grabbing. We'd gone down there like cowboys. We'd pulled the kids out of there. We'd ruined their prospects and, you know, a whole load of stuff. And he sort of tapped into a certain amount of xenophobia. It's a very easy picture to paint in Nepal. These idiots didn't know what they were doing, and look at the damage they've done, you know, blah, 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 blah. And he got the media on side as well. We went from being almost the darling of the media for all the stuff we'd done, you know, bringing kids back from circuses and all the rest of it, to being absolutely pilloried. I had to close my office, and we set up a virtual office in the hotel for our security. To the shame of the major organizations that were in Nepal, no one spoke out in our support or defended us. We were left hung out to dry. Worse than that, one particular organization, Mighty Nepal, they complained about us on national radio in a phone-in to the Prime Minister. And they said that, oh, this organization had gone down and done it. That was from another organization within the sector. This is what you're up against. It's not a simple linear, you know, let's go and bring girls back and, you know, rehabilitation, reuniting with families. It is a very complex picture. It's a very dangerous picture. You don't know who your friends are, and your enemies can be pretty nasty indeed. For the first time in my 7 or 8 years of living in Nepal, I had an armed guard on my gate. I had a former Gurkha soldier who was shadowing my wife and children to school every day. You know, we were extremely exposed here, and no one spoke out in our favor. It was very dangerous. The only reason we survived was that after this guy had kicked up a huge stink, the Nepal authorities said, look, you must look after these children, which is what we'd intended to do anyhow. Of course we had. You always have to be responsible in a rescue situation. And then it sort of settled down. But basically he had saved himself, and he's still active. It didn't stop there, because here he is again having lunch. Who's he having lunch with? Mr. Abvin Lutijn and Mr. Jan Boer. These are two prominent Dutch evangelists. So this is the international network that was supporting Dr. Job, and they're having lunch together in Kathmandu. And I had the international Christian, in inverted commas. I'm a Christian myself, and I come from a very Christian family. I had the extreme Christian evangelical end justifies the means bunch ganged up against me as well. And it, as if it wasn't bad enough, just trying to sort out what we were doing in Nepal. I actually heard these guys were in town, and Kathmandu is a very small place. And I actually emailed this guy out of the blue. I said, "Here you're in Kathmandu, would you like to meet up and I'll tell you what it's all about?" He didn't dare reply, but the other guy did. And we met up, and I laid it all out to him what this guy's background was. This guy who was being presented by Dr. Job as the Reverend Federa, a good Samaritan who had done all this work to help these kids. I laid it all out what his true background was. But these guys, I mean, he said to me, "Look, why didn't you just go and do something with the sex trade? Why did you intervene in this?" And they just didn't want to see it. So I don't know. I mean, essentially, as I say, we shut down this trafficking route as well. We exposed the scandal. Dr. Job died a year or two afterwards, and that was great. There's still the ramifications to a certain extent. This picture was taken a month ago. There's a young woman now called Chukut Lama, who's one of the kids who was taken to Dr. Job's place at the age of 5. My charity is now funding her through her bachelor's in social work degree in Kathmandu. She's coming to for class. She's got another 2 years to run. That's her on the right, reaching into the group. She comes to our girls' hostel in Kathmandu, where she teaches non-formal education. I always say I'm not a charitable person. We don't just fund the girl through university. You have to do something in return. So that's her giving her time voluntarily. So we're doing this, and this sort of gives to the lie of, all these people, they just cut these kids loose and left them high and dry. Not at all. And we still have a responsibility by choice to girls like Chukut Lama. But I suppose, I sort of came away from, just to sort of round off the trafficking side of things, I came away from that experience thinking, well, I've done that now. I've closed down 2 trafficking routes. I've certainly done what I wanted to do in memory of my first wife. I've learned a lot of lessons. I didn't really want to continue on in trafficking because, I don't know, you sort of look at for example, the sex trade side of things, which is the really big, trafficking area, cross-border trafficking into the brothels of India and so on. And you just think, you will not win there. That is a very harsh reality. It's a harsh thing to sort of face that, because what are you up against? You're up against all those sort of society attitudes, gender discrimination and a certain amount of ethnic discrimination. The kids are coming from, a lot of the time, coming from South Nepal, where girls don't count for very much. Try and change those sort of society attitudes, good luck. On top of that, you've got so much lined up against you that it's an unequal battle. I've spent the last 21 years scrabbling around looking for money, fundraising, and we're raising bits of money here, bits of money there, and it's great. Of course, it's great, but it's hard work. If you compare that with the amount of money that's floating around in the trafficking world, they can buy off protection, they can pay off the police, they can do whatever they want, and maybe we bring a girl back and give her sewing lessons or something. We just cannot compete with that. You're not going to win that battle. That is the reality. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't fight it, but just think, for a small charity such as ours, we couldn't really, I think, find a focus within that where we'd be assured of winning. And for me, that's really important. I have to take on something that I know I can make a tangible difference to, and a very clear difference to. Both of those trafficking scenarios were clear cut and of a suitable scale to do that. I just don't, again, just like in 1999, I don't want to get lost in a great sea of need. And so I kind of withdrew from that, thinking this is probably an unwinnable battle. Trafficking is going to continue, for decades and possibly centuries to come, sadly. that's the reality. And really, I've sort of moved into other areas. And where am I now? Just I've taken a big jump. Pipal Tree, brand new website, which launched in February last month. The website, by the way, is structured around an approach called story brand, which I would recommend to you if you want to do some very interesting reading on how you present, be it your charity or your business or whatever you want to do in life. If you haven't heard of it, story brand, one word, by a guy called Don Miller, and he presents a very strong formula for how to present your case, and I'd recommend that book very highly. But essentially, one of the things that he talks about is on your website, it should have the grunt factor. So someone who grunts should be able to visit your website and within 5 seconds know what you're about. The picture, the text, it's all there in your face straight away. You don't have to sit and analyze it. Now, what's that about? And I suppose this really epitomizes where I am at the minute of getting money to the right place in Nepal, and making sure it doesn't go astray and making sure it's spent properly. And I suppose as time has gone on, I have seen the kind of obscenity of so much need in Nepal, genuine need, genuine poverty, hardship, and so much money that's being poured into the place. It's going to the wrong places, such as fake orphanages, for example. And what I am now doing as the kind of prime mover of Pipal Tree is saying, right, if you want to invest money in Nepal, come and speak to us. I wish that a website like this had existed 22 years ago when I started. I wish there'd been a guide there who said, look, I'll give you the various steers that you need and support you along the way. You'll not waste your money. I wasted an awful lot of money with hindsight, because I didn't know any better. But I know a lot of things now, and I know when the alarm bells ring and so on. So that's kind of what we're doing. And for me, in many respects, what are your priorities? My number one priority is my own conscience over everything else. It's all the children come first and the beneficiaries come. Well, that's very worthy. My first priority is my conscience. I have to be able to look friends, family, my big brother, everybody in the eye and say, your money has been spent well, it's been spent correctly, and it's gone to the right place, and I have supervised that as close as I possibly can. That is my number one priority. And that's really the angle that Pipal Tree is coming in at. Sorry, I should have just gone back previous. And note the wording is very careful. It gets to the point of greatest need in our Nepal projects. So if someone comes and says, oh, I want to build a temple, I'm not interested. It's spending it in our projects, of course. And these are the 4 project areas that Pipal Tree is involved in. So we've got the vulnerable and abused children mental health rehabilitation, which is very much the kind of historical work that dates right back to even to the children in prisons, but certainly the children in the circuses. That kind of work is continuing, very much so. Empowering girls and women that I alluded to when I showed you the pictures of the artwork. Community support and education, focusing on marginalised people. Again, South Nepal, these ethnic minorities who have had a very bad deal over the years. And then the 4th one, which is probably it is my major operational priority, and that's the environment and climate change. I'm not going to go into that in huge amount of detail, apart from saying we have a huge problem. It's in Nepal, it's also, of course, the whole world. But let's just look at Nepal. This mountain is turning brown, as are so many of the other mountains in the Himalayas. They're turning brown before our very eyes. I know this mountain very well because I used to walk my dogs down the road in the morning and you'd see that white mountain staring at you. That's what it's looking like now. It's changing very rapidly. Nepal is rated as being the 9th most climate impacted climate change impacted country in the world by an organization called German Watch. But as I say, at the end of the day, we're all in absolutely the same boat. It's just Nepal's feeling the biggest impact at the minute. It's in the front line. And what's happening here is that the Himalayas, as you're probably aware, it's known as our third pole. So we've got the North Pole, the South Pole, and then the Himalayas. And that mountain range is so important for the whole region because the snow, the glaciers feed the rivers, and the rivers, of course, fuel the agriculture. The glaciers are shrinking. When the glaciers go, the rivers go. I mean, the regional impact on that is just beyond comprehension, actually. We're seeing already the floods as well. So we're getting the climate change impact in Nepal. When I first went to Nepal in 1999, certainly even 2004, you could set your watch by the monsoon. It would start on the 15th of June, almost to the day, and it would run through to the 15th of September, almost to the day. Now it's all over the place, and we're getting not just floods, we're getting droughts as well. We're getting the extremes of weather. And who's that hitting? It's hitting the poor people in South Nepal. That's where this picture was taken. These are the floods of 2017, with some really harrowing images came out of that. I mean, that's a father, consigning his dead baby to the waters. I mean, they had nowhere to bury the child or do a cremation. Just let the baby float off. I mean, awful. I'm just so haunted by that. And then quite recently, you might have heard there was a disaster in North India where a bit of glacier broke off and just barreled down a valley and swept everything in front of it. And that's that for that. You can see that bit of glacier has broken off there. I mean, these disasters are happening, and that's on top of the actual, general disaster in terms of the impact on agriculture and the social impact. Of course, all those things are going to fuel trafficking as well, if you want to really, follow that argument to its logical conclusion.
I'm just worried about the time because
this is my last slide, Haley. Yeah.
Okay, we're doing. I know they're going to have lots of questions for you.
Yeah, we're doing reforestation. We're 32 hectares of a community forest being restored by us. We planted 29,000 saplings. This morning I was having an exchange. It could well be we're adding another 12 hectares to that. Is that going to have a big effect on climate change? Probably not. However, what I'm aiming to do is to support the communities, to develop livelihoods, because it's these poor people in South Nepal who are going to feel the impact of what the people in wealthy countries are doing. That's the bottom line. So that's what I'm working on at the minute. Final picture, but one very happy memories of the 24-hour race. Haley there, Chris Schrader. I'm still running. I ran the London Marathon in 2019 at the grand old age of 59, 2 years ago. I ran it in a personal best, non-stop. I was very pleased to run past all the 20-year-olds who were walking at the 20-mile point. I'm still running, a little plug. I'll be running the virtual London Marathon on the 3rd of October. If anybody out there would like to join me on the virtual London Marathon, please just ping me an email. I'm asking for £300 of sponsorship, which is 3,000 Hong Kong dollars, which isn't a vast amount of money. And you can run the London Marathon complete with a runner's number like I was wearing there from anywhere in the world. And at the end of it all, you'll get your medal and your runner's vest. And that's me.